The wind came off the plains with a dry whistle that carried dust, memory, and warning all at once. Folks in that border town said a man could hear the truth clearer when the land was quiet. But on the day she was sent away, nothing felt quiet at all. Horses stamped near the rail fence. A single wagon stood ready, and a young woman in a plain dress stared at a horizon she had never planned to cross. She had already lost a husband, a home, and her place in polite company. Now she was about to lose the last thing that still felt like her own, the right to choose what came next. Her father stood stiff beside the porch, boots planted like roots in bad soil. He had once been a respected rancher, a man who believed order kept the world from slipping into chaos. Divorce, in his eyes, was not just a family shame. It was a public wound. People whispered at church. Neighbors lowered their voices when she passed. He said he could not afford weakness, not on his land and not under his name. So he made a bargain that would silence the talk and teach his daughter a lesson he believed she had failed to learn. The deal was spoken in short, hard sentences. She would go west, beyond the last settled fence line, to live among the Apache. Not as a prisoner, he insisted, but as a wife promised through custom and agreement. He said it was fair. He said it was final. What he did not say was that the arrangement was meant as punishment, a way to cast her out while telling himself he had done right by his blood. She did not cry when he told her. Tears had already been spent on the night her marriage ended, on the morning she packed her things alone, on every sideways look since. What she felt now was a hollow calm, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. She asked only one question, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. Would she be safe? Her father nodded once and turned away, as if the matter no longer concerned him. The Apache man arrived before noon. He rode a dark horse and sat straight in the saddle, his posture calm, his eyes watchful. He was not dressed like the painted savages the town papers liked to describe. His clothes were worn but cared for. His hair was long, tied back with simple leather. He carried himself like someone used to open ground and hard choices. When he looked at her, there was no hunger in his gaze, no triumph. Only a quiet assessment, as if he already understood the trouble wrapped around this meeting. The townsfolk kept their distance, pretending to be busy while stealing glances. Some faces held fear, others curiosity, a few something close to relief that the scandal would soon be gone. She felt like a package being handed over, marked and judged. Yet when the Apache dismounted and spoke, his voice was low and controlled, not rough or threatening. He addressed her father with respect, then turned to her, waiting. That pause mattered more than any promise spoken aloud. He said her journey would not begin unless she chose to step forward. The words surprised everyone, including her father. Custom had been agreed upon, but the Apache did not reach for her arm or demand obedience. He waited, hands open at his sides. In that moment, she realized this man did not see her as property. He saw her as a person caught in a decision that should have been hers from the start. The land beyond the town pulled at her, wide and uncertain. Staying meant living under a roof where her past would always be used against her. Leaving meant stepping into a world she did not understand, guided by a man she did not know. Neither path felt safe. Yet one offered the chance of something new, even if it frightened her. She took a breath, lifted her chin, and stepped off the porch. The wagon rolled west as the town shrank behind them. Dust rose in slow clouds, settling on her shoes and the hem of her dress. The Apache rode beside the wagon, keeping pace, alert to the land. They spoke little at first. Silence filled the space, not heavy but careful. When he did speak, it was to point out a water source ahead or to warn of rough ground. Each word was practical, meant to ease the journey, not claim ownership. As the miles passed, she noticed things she had never been taught to see, how the land changed color with the sun, how birds scattered before unseen danger, how the Apache watched everything without seeming tense. At night, when they camped, he built the fire and stepped back, giving her space. He made it clear she could sleep near the wagon or by the fire, whichever she preferred. The choice, again, was hers. She learned that he had not asked for punishment as part of the bargain. He had wanted a wife, yes, but not one forced into his life as an act of cruelty. He spoke of his people with pride and sorrow, of treaties broken and ground taken, of survival learned the hard way. He did not speak of love, not yet, but there was something in his voice when he talked about family, about responsibility. It made her listen. Still, doubt followed her like a shadow. She wondered if kindness could last, or if it was only the calm before expectations tightened like a snare. She wondered what her father told himself at night, whether he believed he had saved her or erased her. The ache of rejection did not fade just because the horizon changed. When they reached the edge of Apache land, the air felt different, heavier with meaning. She saw distant figures moving across the hills, watched by eyes she could not yet meet. This was no longer a journey. It was an arrival. The Apache slowed his horse and finally spoke words that carried weight. Once they crossed the line marked by stones and memory, her life would be tied to his people as well as his protection. No one would harm her there, he said, but the land demanded honesty and strength in return. She asked him why he had agreed at all. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. He said he had seen too many women traded like goods, their voices lost in deals made by angry men. He did not intend to be another jailer. He wanted a partner who chose to stand beside him, not someone dragged by fate. Whether that choice would come now or later, he could not say. The camp came into view as the sun dipped low. Smoke curled into the sky. Children's laughter carried faintly on the wind. Life continued there, real and unromantic, nothing like the stories whispered back east. Her heart pounded as the wagon slowed. Every step forward felt like crossing a bridge that might not hold. Before they reached the first fire, the Apache reined in his horse and turned to her once more. He told her she could still turn back. He would escort her to the edge of the land and see her safely away. The bargain would break, and the consequences would be his to face. He would not force her hand. She looked ahead at the waiting camp, then back toward the long road she had traveled. The past pulled one way, the unknown another. Her father's punishment had brought her here, but what happened next would be decided by her own will. As the firelight flickered against the darkening sky, she opened her mouth to answer, knowing that whatever she said would change everything. She hesitated at the edge of the camp, the scent of smoke and sun-baked earth thick in her nose. Figures moved in the shadows between tents, alert and cautious, carrying water, bundles of food, and the weight of lives that had been fought for and lost over years she could not yet begin to understand. The Apache beside her said nothing, letting her take in the sight, the sounds, the small hum of life in a place so foreign yet strangely alive. She realized that she had been walking through the quiet judgment of her father's town for too long, and here the silence was different. It was patient, waiting for her to find her place rather than forcing it upon her. He finally dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby post. She noticed the small scar above his left brow, subtle but telling. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had survived more than one fight and perhaps more than one betrayal. "They'll watch," he said softly. "Not because they mean harm, but because trust is earned here and it is not given lightly." She nodded, feeling the weight of every step she had taken toward this moment. There was a quiet dignity in the way he spoke, and yet, beneath it, a current she could not name, a tension, a desire, something older than the land itself. He gestured toward the fire where a few of the Apache sat, their features hidden in the flickering light. "Step forward," he said. "Walk among them, watch, learn." She did. Each step carried both fear and curiosity. The first few glances from the camp were brief, careful, measuring. Children paused in mid-laugh to stare, then ran to safety. A woman tending a pot at the fire whispered to another, their heads moving in silent conversation. She felt as if she had been dropped into a living tapestry, threads of every life here stretching beyond what she could comprehend. The Apache walked beside her, his presence both protective and unyielding. He did not speak unless necessary, and when he did, it was to offer small instruction or explanation. Where water was drawn, which paths were safe to cross, which signs on the land could not be ignored. The simplicity of his guidance belied the complexity she sensed in him. She wondered if he had ever doubted himself in the way her own father's rigid rules forced doubt onto her. He seemed steady, certain, a man built of quiet strength rather than loud command. At night, the camp transformed. Fires flickered across the open ground, casting shadows that danced with stories unspoken. The sound of drums echoed faintly, not for ceremony but for communication warnings, announcements, signals only they could interpret. She lay near the wagon, staring into the flames, listening. Each sound, each movement felt like part of a code she was meant to decipher. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she would have to, or she would never belong here. She learned the Apache's name during the night, spoken between the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind. He said it once, quietly, almost as if admitting it would change something. She repeated it softly, tasting the syllables, feeling their weight. Names mattered here. They carried history, lineage, respect, and expectation. His name was not easy to forget, and when she spoke it, she felt a subtle shift, as if acknowledging it opened a door she had not known existed. The next day brought lessons she could not have imagined. The Apache introduced her to the rhythms of the land, the way animals moved, the tracks that told stories of predators and prey, the subtle language of wind and water. She stumbled at first, tripping over roots and stones, missing the signs that others took for granted. He corrected her gently, never mocking, but with a patience she found both maddening and comforting. Every failure reminded her of the life she had left behind and the life she was just beginning to understand. By midday, she began to notice a quiet strength in herself. Her muscles ached, but she felt alive in a way she had not in years. The Apache watched her silently, never pushing, never praising, just observing. And in his gaze, she sometimes caught a flash of look that lingered too long to be casual, too brief to be fully read. She could not tell if it was curiosity, approval, or something closer to desire, and that thought made her pulse quicken with confusion. There was danger in every lesson, unspoken but present. A rustle in the brush could signal a predator or a stranger. A shadow in the trees might conceal a thief or a scout. She learned that life here demanded vigilance, that safety was a privilege earned, and that trust came slowly, as fragile as the desert flowers that bloomed only under the harshest sun. The Apache reminded her constantly that this was not play, not adventure, not punishment, it was survival. And survival required both caution and courage. She began to understand why he had been chosen to meet her, why he had not simply taken her without question. His strength was visible in muscle and skill, but it was deeper, rooted in mind and spirit. He carried the weight of generations, of knowledge, of responsibility. She saw it in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he measured not just the land but the people in it. There was no boast in him, no claim of superiority. There was only the quiet authority of someone who had faced hardship and lived, and in that she felt a strange sense of hope. At the same time, shadows of doubt lingered. She could not ignore the fear that her father's intentions had not entirely failed. The punishment, the exile, the handing over to the Apache, these were all his ways of controlling the narrative, of shaping what he could not prevent. She wondered if she was merely a pawn in someone else's game, if her choices would ever truly matter. And yet, each glance from the Apache reminded her that this might be the first place where she could make decisions that truly belonged to her. Late in the afternoon, as the sun fell low and the camp began to settle, a distant howl echoed across the plains. The Apache stiffened, ears sharp, hands resting lightly on the hilt of a knife at his side. She froze, understanding instantly that danger was never far, and that the land itself was alive with threats she could not yet read. He did not speak at first, simply watching the horizon, reading the invisible lines of wind and shadow. Then he spoke, low and controlled, telling her to stay close, that this sound was not ordinary, that the night could bring more than cold. Her heartbeat thrummed in her ears, louder than the wind or the approaching dark. She felt the tension coil in her stomach, the primal urge to run, to hide, to resist what she could not yet name. The Apache's calm presence anchored her, but it also reminded her of the responsibility she now carried, not just to herself, but to the man who had chosen to respect her agency, the people who would watch her closely, and the land that demanded both courage and cunning. When night fell fully, she lay awake under a sky filled with stars, each one burning like a promise or a warning. She thought of the town she had left, of her father's stern face, of the whispers that would follow her no matter how far she traveled. She thought of the Apache beside her, strong, patient, unknowable, and wondered what kind of life she would carve from the raw world before her. There was fear, yes, but also a spark of something else possibility. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that the hardest trials had not yet arrived. The land might teach her to survive, but it would not teach her to trust, not completely. The Apache might be a guide, a protector, a force for good, but he carried his own secrets, his own burdens. The shadows of the past, the weight of her father's punishment, and the uncertainties of this new life pressed in from every side. Somewhere deep in the night, a distant sound different from the howl, closer, deliberate, reminded her that she was not alone. Something watched from beyond the firelight. Something patient. Something waiting. The Apache moved silently, alert, eyes scanning the horizon. He did not speak, but his posture shifted, tense, ready. She felt the tension ripple through her, the realization that the story her father had set in motion was far from over. As dawn approached, painting the sky with pale gold and the faint blush of pink, she understood that her life had entered a chapter she could not control, yet one she must navigate with care. Every lesson, every glance, every decision would shape what was to come. And somewhere beneath the surface of this strange, unforgiving land, she sensed a connection forming, one that could be her salvation or her undoing. The Apache remained close, a silent presence as she took her first tentative steps toward the inner camp. She could see the people now, faces partially illuminated by the first light, watching her with wary eyes. Some were children, some elders, some warriors, each carrying their own stories of hardship and survival. They did not speak at first, only observed, and she felt the weight of their scrutiny pressing against her like the wind against the plains. She glanced at the Apache, who simply nodded, as if giving her permission to face the unknown. The wind carried the scent of smoke, dirt, and the strange sweetness of early morning flowers. Somewhere in that mixture was the promise of change, danger, and discovery. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and stepped forward, knowing that what lay ahead would test every part of her courage, every lesson she had learned, and every hidden desire that had long been kept in check. And yet, in the back of her mind, a single thought persisted. The Apache wanted her, truly wanted her, not as a punishment, not as a bargain, but as something far more complicated. That knowledge made her pulse quicken, made her question every instinct, every fear, and every hope she had carried across the plains. She did not know what he intended, what he had seen in her, or how far that desire would reach, but she would soon find out, in a land where choice, trust, and survival were forever intertwined. The first step into the inner camp was taken, but the journey was only beginning. The air was thick with possibility, danger, and questions that demanded answers she could not yet find. The Apache moved beside her, silent, watchful, unshakable. The camp waited. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the firelight, beyond the reach of her father's rigid control, a story that could not be predicted was ready to unfold. The camp settled into the rhythm of early morning. Smoke curled lazily from small fires, and the sounds of movement feet shifting on dry ground. The snap of leather straps, the low murmur of conversation filled the space with life. She moved carefully, every step measured, aware that her presence alone was a disruption. The Apache walked slightly ahead, watching both her and the perimeter, his eyes sharp as he scanned the hills beyond. Even now, the wind carried a tension she could not name, as if the land itself was testing her, gauging whether she belonged. She was not the only one watching. Elders sat cross-legged near the fires, their faces etched with lines that told stories she could not read. Children peeked from behind canvas flaps, curiosity mixed with caution. Warriors stood in small clusters, speaking in low tones she could not understand, throwing occasional glances toward her and the man beside her. Each look held assessment and caution. She realized quickly that she would have to prove herself, not just to him, but to everyone in this place that moved to its own rules. The Apache introduced her to a few families, explaining in short sentences who she was and why she had come. There was no ceremony, no loud declaration of arrival. Life here did not tolerate theatrics. She noticed that the people responded not with fear or resentment, but with the same quiet caution she had learned to wear. Their eyes asked questions. Who is she really? Can she endure this place? Does she understand what it means to belong here? When they stopped by a water source, she watched him carefully, trying to learn what she could. He did not treat her like a stranger, but neither did he treat her like an equal yet. He guided her movements with subtle instruction, how to carry a bucket without spilling, how to balance on uneven rocks, how to notice small changes in the water's surface that could warn of danger upstream. Every lesson carried more than its surface meaning. Each was a test of patience, endurance, and observation. She felt herself growing sharper, more alert, though the fatigue in her body reminded her that this was not a gentle training. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to her father and the town she had left behind. His face, stern and unyielding, haunted her more than she expected. She wondered if he truly believed he had done the right thing, or if he was simply protecting his pride. She could almost hear his voice now, judging her decisions, calculating the consequences she had not yet lived through. The anger she carried toward him remained, tangled with a lingering grief she could not release. Meanwhile, the Apache seemed to sense her inner turbulence. He said little, but the small gestures, the glance when she hesitated, the gentle correction when she faltered carried weight. There was a patience in him that was almost maddening, the kind that refused to rush her, refused to give answers that might ease her mind. It was a lesson she would have to learn, that control could be exercised without force and influence without command. As the sun climbed higher, the camp became more active. A group of young men practiced with bows and spears near the edge of the clearing. The sound of wood and sinew snapping under tension carried across the open space. One of the older warriors, noticing her interest, motioned for her to come closer. She did, and the Apache followed without a word. He explained briefly what each motion meant, how balance and timing mattered, and how mistakes could have consequences far beyond what she might imagine. The woman's pulse quickened. The skill required was intense, and yet she felt a thrill at the challenge, the first spark of engagement with a world that demanded more than obedience or compliance. As afternoon turned toward evening, a scout arrived from beyond the ridge. Dust clung to his boots and clothing. He spoke urgently to the Apache in a language she could not follow, but she noticed the change in the man's posture. Alertness turned to concern, and concern sharpened to tension that pulled at every muscle in his body. He glanced at her once, briefly, and then addressed the scout in low, clipped sentences. The words were swift and commanding, leaving her no room to question, only to observe. Later, as the camp gathered for the evening meal, whispers ran among the elders. She could not understand the language, but the tone was clear. There was news of danger, and it was not distant. The Apache moved among them, listening, evaluating, making quiet decisions that no one questioned. She watched him, realizing how much of the responsibility for this community rested on his shoulders. The quiet intensity she had noticed before was now a tangible weight, one that seemed to press on everyone present. By firelight, the tension of the day settled into a different kind of unease. The wind shifted, carrying sounds from the distant plains that hinted at movement she could not see. Shadows flickered in the corners of the camp, and she noticed the children retreating earlier than usual, the adults exchanging glances that spoke of concern and preparation. It was a subtle alert, not a warning shouted across the land, but it carried the weight of meaning she could not ignore. The Apache sat beside her quietly, breaking bread in silence. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but words felt inadequate. How could she express the conflict building inside her loyalty to herself? Fear of the unknown, curiosity about him, anger at her father without revealing weakness? He looked at her once, as if sensing the questions forming behind her eyes, and then turned his gaze to the fire. She understood then that some lessons here were not taught with words, but with observation and reflection. Night deepened, and with it came the first distant sound of hooves on dry earth. Not fast, not urgent, but enough to pull her from her thoughts. She noticed the Apache stiffen, scanning the horizon. The elders whispered to one another, the warriors moving to stand along the perimeter. She felt the tension in the air like a tangible thing, pressing against her skin. She realized that life here would always demand vigilance, that danger was constant, and that trust, even in those closest to her, could not be assumed. As hours passed, the hooves drew closer, then receded, leaving the camp alert but untested. She asked the Apache what had happened. He gave a measured answer, explaining that scouts had reported movement from beyond the hills, potential trouble but nothing immediate. "We must always be ready," he said, his tone even but firm. "The land does not forgive mistakes. Neither do those who live upon it." Her mind raced with questions she did not voice. Who was approaching? Why had the scouts been able to spot them first? What threats lay beyond the hills that she could not yet see? She realized that her father's punishment had brought her here, but the trials of this place were entirely of its own making. She was not just a visitor. She was a participant in a world that demanded awareness, courage, and adaptability. She watched him as he moved among the camp, issuing instructions, acknowledging concerns, and observing the environment. There was no show of power, no unnecessary display of skill, but the authority he wielded was unmistakable. Everyone listened, obeyed, and respected him not because they had to, but because they understood that his judgment was sound. She felt a mixture of admiration and fear. The same man who had offered her agency also bore the responsibility to protect the people who might never forgive failure. The next morning, the tension of yesterday lingered like a shadow. She rose early, the memory of the hooves and the scout fresh in her mind. The Apache moved beside her as they tended to routine tasks, water, fire, and preparation of food, but the air between them carried an unspoken current. He was careful, deliberate, measured. She was careful, tentative, alert. Neither spoke much, yet both knew that the world around them demanded more than casual attention. During breakfast, one of the elders approached, speaking in the same low, cautious tone. The Apache translated briefly, explaining that the elder had news of another group moving through the northern plains, unknown in intent, untracked. The camp would need to prepare, he said. She felt a tightening in her chest. This was not a town with predictable neighbors or safe roads. This was a place where every decision could mean survival or disaster. The day became a test in vigilance. Scouts moved farther into the hills, warriors practiced silently, children were kept close, and the elders conferred in corners where she could only watch. She followed the Apache through it all, noting the small signs he read in the land-broken twigs, tracks in dirt, the subtle bend of grass under wind. She began to understand why he had been chosen to meet her, why his presence carried more than protection. He could see, anticipate, and prepare for threats she could not yet comprehend. At midday, as the sun beat down on the open plains, a distant cry rose from the ridge. The Apache stiffened, every muscle alert. Warriors moved toward the sound, weapons in hand, the camp holding its collective breath. She wanted to step forward to see, to understand, but he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," he said. "Watch and learn. The land teaches patience before action." She obeyed, though the tension in her chest made it hard to breathe. The distant figure on the ridge remained unseen, yet its presence felt vast, pressing against the edges of the camp like a shadow threatening to expand. She realized that survival here depended not just on strength or skill, but on awareness, instinct, and the willingness to confront danger without panic. Hours passed without further incident, yet the unease remained. She understood that this was only the beginning. The land had secrets. People had histories she did not know, and the man beside her carried burdens that were hidden but immense. Every glance he cast, every gesture he made, was measured against unseen threats and past experiences. She felt herself drawn into a web of observation, caution, and subtle teaching that left no room for ignorance. As night fell again, the fires glowed against the darkened landscape. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the light, and whispers of movement beyond the camp carried on the wind. The Apache sat close to her, scanning the horizon, alert but calm. She felt the duality of fear and fascination, knowing that he wanted her, but also knowing that this desire was tempered by respect, vigilance, and the heavy weight of responsibility. She realized that her journey was no longer about punishment or exile. It was about learning a world she did not know, understanding a man she could barely read, and confronting dangers that had been invisible to her all her life. The land, the people, the Apache all demanded patience, courage, and a willingness to see beyond fear. And as the first stars pierced the sky, she understood something she had not yet admitted to herself. The story of her life was no longer her father's to dictate. It belonged to her, the land, and the man who had waited beside her with quiet intent. But the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with tension, and full of choices that could change everything. She did not yet know what lay beyond the ridge, what threats or opportunities the coming days would bring, or how the feelings stirring between them would shape the life she was only beginning to claim. She leaned back against the wagon, eyes tracing the horizon, listening to the whispers of the wind and the faint rustle of life in the camp. Somewhere beyond, the unknown waited, patient, dangerous, and inevitable. And she knew, deep down, that the Apache wanted her, but what he truly intended was a question she could not yet answer, leaving the night thick with possibility and peril. The morning air was brittle and sharp, carrying the faint tang of smoke from the fires that had burned all night. She could feel it in her lungs, a reminder that the land demanded more than mere presence. It demanded attention, awareness, and readiness. The Apache was already awake, sitting astride his horse with a quiet watchfulness that seemed effortless, though she knew it was anything but. He had grown even more distant in these days, not cold, but measured, calculating. Every glance he cast, every slight shift of his body, spoke of danger, threat, and responsibility she could not yet fully read. They moved through the camp with purpose. The elders had gathered to discuss reports from scouts who had ventured farther north, near the ridge where the first sound of hooves had been heard days before. Movement there had grown frequent, subtle but persistent, like the brush of wind signaling a storm. Some of the scouts had reported distant fires, smoke curling thin and low, and the Apache listened with a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. She had begun to understand slowly that this man saw far more than the eye could catch, that his judgment was rooted not in instinct alone, but in years of experience and careful observation. He spoke to her now in clipped, deliberate words. "Stay close, watch the ridge, learn what it tells you. The wind, the land, the signs left by those who move without notice. They speak if you can hear them." She nodded, feeling the weight of his instruction. She wanted to ask questions, but the urgency in his tone left no room. He was teaching her, and the lesson was survival. The ridge had become the focus of the camp's attention. Warriors moved along its edge, bows ready, eyes scanning the horizon. She followed the Apache, heart pounding, aware that this was no longer an ordinary threat. Something approached, something deliberate. Even the younger scouts, confident and quick, had returned with tense expressions, voices low, warning of movement beyond the hills. The sun rose higher, and with it came a heat that pressed against the dry earth. Dust clung to skin and clothing, and sweat burned her eyes as she tried to keep pace. She noticed small signs, broken twigs, faint footprints, grass pressed flat in unnatural patterns that told her the presence of others, hidden but near. The Apache saw them too, every one, yet he remained calm, controlled, speaking only when necessary. It was a lesson in observation and patience, one that left her on edge, or where the danger had taken form but not yet revealed itself fully. By midday, the tension was palpable. The camp had grown silent, warriors stationed strategically, children kept under watchful eyes, elders whispering urgently. She had learned quickly that every movement mattered, every sound carried meaning. The ridge remained still, yet she knew the quiet was not comfort, it was a warning. The Apache moved beside her, scanning the horizon, his horse shifting beneath him like a coiled spring. She felt the weight of the moment, a tension that stretched every nerve and muscle in her body. When a scout returned, panting and urgent, the Apache took the report with a grave nod. The northern fires were closer, the movement more deliberate, and the unknown travelers were not ordinary passers-by. He relayed the news to the camp in precise, quiet sentences, issuing instructions that were absorbed without question. She watched, noticing how authority here was not demanded, it was recognized. And yet, for all the control he exerted, there was no arrogance, only responsibility and the constant awareness that a single misstep could cost lives. Afternoon stretched into evening. Shadows lengthened, fires burned low, and the ridge remained ominously still. The Apache and a few warriors rode toward the northern hills, leaving her to follow at a distance, learning to read the land and the signs he had taught her to see. Every step was a lesson in vigilance, every glance an assessment of risk. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her hands tight against her sides, aware that the world around her could shift from calm to chaos in a heartbeat. As twilight approached, the first movement appeared on the horizon. Figures emerged from the distant hills, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. They were cautious, deliberate, moving with purpose, and yet trying to remain unseen. The Apache stiffened, signaling the camp and the warriors with subtle hand gestures. She understood immediately the moment they had been preparing for had arrived. The camp erupted into quiet, controlled activity. Fires were adjusted, positions taken, children moved to safety, and every adult had a role. She followed the Apache, keeping low, heart hammering as the distance between them and the approaching figures shrank. She noticed details, the glint of metal in the sunlight, the rhythm of their movement, the way they scanned the land as if expecting resistance. Every instinct told her to flee, but she remained, anchored by the presence of the Apache and the strange trust that had begun to grow between them. The first figures were close enough now that their expressions could be read. They were not strangers in need, nor were they traders or travelers. They carried weapons, and their faces were hardened, determined. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The Apache moved with precision, issuing orders to the warriors with a calm authority that contrasted the storm of anxiety building inside her. She could feel the urgency, the unspoken fear, and the knowledge that any misstep could tip the balance toward violence. As darkness fell, torches and fires lit the ridge, throwing long, sharp shadows across the plains. The Apache remained close, his presence a constant, steadying force. He spoke briefly, his voice low but commanding. "Watch, learn, but do not act unless told. This is not for your hands alone. Observe, understand, decide later." She nodded, muscles tense, aware that she was a witness and participant in something far larger than herself. The attackers paused at the edge of the ridge, sizing up the camp, their intentions still unclear. Every warrior held position, every child was hidden, and the elders whispered prayers under their breath. She noticed the Apache scanning not just the movement but the land, reading invisible signs, anticipating every possible outcome. She had never seen anyone so completely attuned to the environment, so aware of both danger and opportunity. Suddenly, a faint crack of movement caught her attention, a small sound almost swallowed by the wind. She froze, heart racing. The Apache's hand moved slightly, signaling readiness. The figures on the ridge shifted, perhaps noticing her presence, perhaps not, but the tension escalated, thickening the night like smoke. Every second stretched, the anticipation building, every muscle in her body poised for action she could not yet take. Time slowed as the first signs of confrontation began. The attackers adjusted their stance, some stepping forward, others remaining hidden. The Apache moved with silent precision, coordinating the warriors with gestures, looks, and subtle commands that kept the camp in perfect readiness. She watched, tense, aware that any miscalculation could unravel everything: the safety of the camp, the lives within it, and the fragile trust she had begun to build with the Apache. She realized then that this was more than a test of survival. It was a test of will, of courage, of her ability to remain calm under pressure. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to protect herself, yet every lesson the Apache had taught her now demanded focus, observation, and patience. She clenched her fists, forcing her pulse to settle, and studied the attackers with every ounce of awareness she could muster. The night stretched on, the standoff tense and unresolved. Figures shifted in the firelight, shadows lengthened, and the camp remained alert, ready for whatever move would come next. She felt the Apache's presence behind her, silent but commanding, a reminder that she was not alone, yet also that responsibility for what was to come would be shared, not taken from her. Her mind raced, thinking of her father, of the town she had left, of the life that had been taken from her by decisions not her own. She realized that every moment she spent here, every lesson she absorbed, was building towards something she could not yet name. The Apache wanted her, yes, but the bond forming between them was complicated by danger, uncertainty, and the weight of the land itself. She felt anticipation coil like a living thing, tight and urgent, promising change, but refusing to reveal how it would arrive. As the first hour of darkness passed, movement on the ridge became sharper, more deliberate. Figures shifted with purpose, one stepping forward, another retreating. The Apache adjusted positions in response, silent, efficient, and relentless. She could feel the tension peak, every nerve ending alert, every glance a calculation, every breath held in anticipation of the first spark that might ignite a confrontation. She wanted to speak, to ask what would happen next, but the words caught in her throat. She realized she had entered a world where words were secondary to action, where observation, timing, and trust determined outcomes. She watched the ridge, the fires, the shadows, the subtle signs she had learned to read, and felt her pulse quicken, knowing that the moment of reckoning was near. The Apache moved closer, his hand brushing hers briefly as if to steady her. She felt the warmth of him, the assurance that he was present, yet knew that what was about to unfold would demand courage, not comfort. The figures on the ridge had paused, and for a brief instant, the night seemed to hold its breath, every living thing in the camp suspended in anticipation. And then, a sudden crack of movement, a figure breaking cover, the glint of metal in torchlight, the first overt signal of aggression. The tension exploded. Warriors moving into position, the Apache issuing commands, and she was caught between fear, exhilaration, and the realization that the test of everything she had learned was about to begin. Every glance, every movement, every decision now mattered, and the night had become a crucible, forging the moments that would decide the survival of the camp, her own place in it, and the unspoken bond forming with the man who had brought her here. She drew a breath, heart hammering, senses alert to the faintest sound. The ridge held secrets yet to be revealed. The attackers remained unknown, and the Apache beside her was both guide and protector, his intentions as mysterious as the land itself. The night had reached its peak tension, the climax of fear, anticipation, and untested courage. Every second stretched into eternity. Every shadow could conceal danger. Every movement carried consequence. And in that darkness, with the fires flickering and the ridge looming, she understood that the resolution of her trials, the fate of the camp, and the promise of what might be between her and the Apache were all poised on the edge of revelation. The story teetered on a knife's edge, the climax waiting to erupt, the tension almost unbearable, leaving her and everyone around her suspended in the moment before the storm. The first crack of fire from the ridge was followed by a tense silence, broken only by the rustle of the wind through dry grass. The Apache moved with precision, signaling warriors, adjusting positions, and reading the land like an open book. She stayed low, heart pounding, every sense sharp as a blade. For a moment, she feared the worst, that all the lessons, all the care, would not be enough to keep the camp safe. But then, slowly, the movements shifted. The attackers hesitated, uncertain, sensing the readiness of the defenders. A few steps later, the cause of the aggression became clear. The group had not been bandits nor enemies of the Apache, but displaced travelers' families caught in the same harsh lands, desperate and driven by hunger. The weapons in their hands had been lifted in fear rather than malice, and the tension that had threatened to erupt into violence melted as recognition passed between them. The Apache lowered his hand, signaling the camp to stand down, and approached the group with the calm authority that had held the night in check. She watched as he spoke, listening even without understanding every word. There was no anger, no punishment, only the quiet, commanding presence that drew both fear and respect. He offered water, food, and guidance, and slowly the fear that had stiffened the newcomers softened. Families moved forward cautiously, accepting the help extended to them. The relief in the camp was palpable, a shared exhale after the long tension of the night. She felt her shoulders relax for the first time since arriving, a sense of safety settling over her like sunlight after a storm. As the newcomers were guided into the camp, the Apache turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with a depth she had not yet fully comprehended. He did not speak at first, letting the moment stretch, letting the unspoken understanding between them form. She felt the pulse of connection, the quiet acknowledgement that she had survived, that she had learned, and that she had chosen to face this life rather than retreat. There was no grand declaration, only a shared understanding that the bond between them had grown from respect, trust, and mutual endurance. The evening passed differently than any before. Fires burned brighter, stories were shared, and the laughter of children echoed softly through the camp. The Apache moved beside her again, not as a guide or protector, but as a companion in the quiet hours. She noticed the small gestures, the way he handed her water, the careful attention to her comfort, the unspoken care that had always been there, masked by vigilance. She realized then that his desire for her had never been about possession, but about recognition, about wanting her to choose him freely, to stand beside him willingly. The days that followed were calm yet purposeful. She learned more of the customs, the traditions, and the ways of the Apache people. She observed the elders, listened to the stories of the land, and absorbed lessons that went far beyond survival. She learned to track the movement of animals, to read the subtle signs in the weather, and to understand the rhythm of a life lived in balance with the earth. The Apache continued to guide her, always patient, always attentive, but never intrusive. The quiet strength he possessed had become a constant in her life, a foundation she could trust. As the trust grew, so did her understanding of herself. She reflected on the punishment her father had intended, the exile he had imposed, and the lessons he thought she needed. She realized that what had begun as a punishment had become an opportunity. She had been forced into a world unfamiliar, yet it had taught her independence, courage, and clarity of purpose. She had learned to navigate danger, to read the unspoken signals of others, and to trust her instincts. The father who had sought to control her had inadvertently placed her on a path towards strength she might never have discovered otherwise. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant hills, she accompanied the Apache to the ridge where the first signs of conflict had appeared. The land was calm, quiet, and alive, every detail crisp in the morning light. He spoke to her as they moved, explaining the significance of the ridge, the history of the travelers, and the lessons embedded in every stone and shadow. She understood then that this was not just land to be survived, it was a teacher, a guide, and a mirror for the courage she had developed. At the edge of the ridge, she stopped and looked out across the plains. The wind carried scents of grass, earth, and distant flowers, and the memory of fear and tension from the nights before seemed distant. The Apache stepped close, hand brushing against hers, a gesture both familiar and intimate. She turned to meet his gaze, seeing the depth of care, patience, and quiet desire reflected there. No words were necessary. They had both endured the trials, faced the unknown, and come through with understanding and respect for one another. The camp welcomed the travelers fully into their fold, and she watched as children laughed together, elders shared food, and warriors trained in harmony. There was still work to do, but the shadow of conflict had lifted, leaving behind a sense of accomplishment, relief, and hope. She understood that life here would always have challenges, yet it was a life chosen rather than imposed. She had become part of a community, a story larger than herself, and a bond with a man who valued her choice above all else. At night, by the fire, she spoke to the Apache for the first time about her fears, her father, and the uncertainty she had carried. He listened without judgment, offering insight and support, reinforcing the trust that had grown between them. She realized that his strength had not been in command alone, but in his ability to respect her autonomy, to guide without forcing, and to care without possession. She had been afraid to trust before, but here she felt safe to do so, and in that safety a deeper connection flourished. The weeks passed with a rhythm of learning, work, and quiet companionship. She trained, observed, and became proficient in skills that had once seemed impossible. The Apache watched with quiet pride, correcting mistakes gently and encouraging her growth. She noticed how he interacted with others, respectful, firm, and thoughtful, and understood that his desire for her had always been rooted in admiration and regard, not dominance. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the camp, the Apache finally spoke of his feelings, not as a demand, but as a confession. He acknowledged his desire, his respect, and his hope that she would choose to be with him, not out of obligation, but out of recognition for the life they could build together. She felt a rush of relief, joy, and certainty. The tension that had followed her since her father's punishment finally gave way to clarity. She could trust, she could choose, and she could embrace the life unfolding before her. In the quiet that followed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a town that measured worth by conformity, from a father's rigid sense of honor, from the fear of exile and uncertainty. She realized that every trial had shaped her, every fear had strengthened her, and every challenge had prepared her to step into a world that was vast, demanding, and full of life. She had faced danger, learned patience, and discovered courage she had not known she possessed. As the Apache stood beside her, hands brushing in a simple gesture of connection, she knew that the journey had brought them both to a moment of balance. Desire, respect, trust, and shared experience had converged, creating a foundation stronger than fear or obligation. She felt gratitude for the land, the people, and the lessons she had learned, and in hope for the days ahead, where choice and partnership would guide the path forward. The camp thrived in the weeks that followed. The newcomers integrated fully, contributing labor, stories, and energy, while the Apache's guidance ensured order and safety. She became skilled, respected, and valued, no longer a guest or an outsider, but a participant in a community that demanded courage, collaboration, and trust. Every challenge that arose was met with calm assessment, careful planning, and shared effort, proving that the bonds forged in adversity were lasting. One evening, as the sun set behind the western hills, she stood with the Apache, watching the horizon glow with gold and amber. They spoke little, but every gesture carried meaning. The camp behind them was alive with quiet celebration, the air filled with laughter, conversation, and the simple joy of survival. She understood then that the punishment intended by her father had been transformed into a path of growth, love, and belonging. She turned to the Apache, and he smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgment of the journey they had taken together. There was no rush, no ceremony needed, only the steady knowledge that they had faced fear, uncertainty, and trials, and had come through stronger, wiser, and united. Her heart, once heavy with doubt and fear, now held trust, courage, and the first deep stirrings of love that were reciprocated and respected. As night fell fully, the camp settled into a calm rhythm. Fires burned low, shadows stretched across the ground, and the wind whispered across the plains. She sat near the fire, leaning against the wagon, feeling a profound sense of peace. The Apache settled beside her, hand lightly touching hers, and she realized that the journey had taught her more than survival. It had taught her choice, respect, and the power of trust. Her father's punishment had brought her to this land, to this life, and to this man. Yet it had also given her the chance to find herself, to discover courage she had not known, and to embrace love and belonging on her own terms. The camp, the land, and the people had tested her, guided her, and ultimately accepted her. And in that acceptance, she found a freedom more enduring than fear, more powerful than obligation, and more satisfying than she could have imagined. The stars emerged above the plains, vast and bright, and she looked up, feeling a connection to the world beyond the ridge, the camp, and the journey that had brought her here. The Apache's presence beside her was steady and reassuring, a promise not made through words but through every action, every choice, every trial shared. She realized that happiness was not given, nor forced, nor earned by compliance alone. It was discovered, nurtured, and chosen. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, she leaned against him, breathing in the scent of earth, smoke, and quiet reassurance. She knew the future would hold challenges, as all life does, but she also knew she would face them with courage, skill, and a partner who respected her, desired her, and valued her choice above all else. The tension that had once defined her life had transformed into understanding, trust, and hope. The camp slept peacefully under the stars. The Apache's hand rested lightly on hers, a quiet anchor. She closed her eyes, reflecting on the journey, the lessons, and the growth she had achieved. The punishment of the past had led to a life of purpose, love, and belonging. She had found strength, respect, and the beginnings of a future built on choice rather than constraint. And as the first light of dawn crept over the western hills, the plains stretching endless and open before them, she smiled softly. The land had taught her, the people had welcomed her, and the Apache had chosen her as she had chosen him. Life, once heavy with uncertainty and fear, was now filled with promise, hope, and the quiet certainty that the story of her life had only just begun, but would unfold with courage, love, and the freedom to choose her own path. The night faded, and the world held a gentle, enduring peace. She stood beside the Apache, watching the sunrise, feeling the weight of the past fall away. The camp was alive with laughter and work, with stories and hope. And she knew, finally, that she had not only survived the punishment of her father, but had discovered a life she could embrace fully, a bond she could trust, and a future she could shape on her own terms. The journey had ended, but the life it opened was just beginning.